This final chapter, Chapter 4, includes 6 quiz questions intended to test your understanding of the materials covered in this module. Question 1. Best Bank has just entered a 1-year FX forward with XYZ, where XYZ sells sterling against dollars at 150. Which of the situations below increases the bank's maximum peak PFE towards XYZ over the life of the contract, assuming all other things remain the same? An increase in the volatility of sterling dollar spot, an increase in sterling interest rates, an increase in XYZ's probability of default over 1 year, an increase in XYZ's loss given default, LGD, which is the amount lost by unsecured creditors of XYZ following a default of XYZ. Here are the 4 permissible answers. Solution to question 1. An increase in the volatility of sterling dollar spot increases the range of expected future forward levels, and therefore the range of future values of the forward contract. PFE reflects positive potential values for the position from the bank's perspective, and maximum PFE is a measure of PFE extreme values. Thus, an increase in the volatility of sterling dollar spot has a direct impact on maximum peak PFE exposure. An increase in sterling interest rates reduces the sterling dollar forward levels. Since XYZ is selling sterling forward, this will have a positive impact on the value of the position from XYZ's perspective, which reduces the exposure for the bank. Therefore, an increase in sterling interest rates will reduce the maximum PFE of the bank towards the client. As explained in the module, neither default probability nor LGD are reflected in the calculation of PFE. Therefore, the correct answer is A, as in apple. Question 2. Best Bank has the following contracts with XYZ, whose fair value from the bank's perspective appears in brackets. A 2-year Euro-Dollar FX forward, a 1-year US Canadian Dollar FX forward, and a 3-year US Dollar Yen structured FX forward. An IRS with a remaining maturity of 3 years, and a FRA with a remaining maturity of 6 months. The 2 parties have signed an enforceable netting agreement covering only FX transactions, and have also executed a bilateral margining agreement with a margining threshold of $2 million and a minimum transferable amount of 0. Best Bank's current exposure to XYZ and the amount of collateral XYZ is required to deliver are respectively, and here are the 4 permissible answers. Solution to question 2. The FX transactions may be netted against each other given the netting agreement for these transactions. Therefore, the current exposure of all FX contracts equals the higher of 0 and the sum of the fair values shown here. So 0 in this case. The interest rate transactions cannot be netted against each other. Therefore, the current exposure from interest rate transactions equals the sum of all positive exposures, which is simply the current $3 million fair value of the IRS. Since the interest rate transactions cannot be netted against the FX transactions, the total current exposure before taking margining into account is $3 million. The margining agreement has a margining threshold of $2 million, and since the minimum transferable amount is 0, any exposure beyond this $2 million, i.e. $1 million in this case, must be fully collateralized. Therefore, the bank's current exposure towards XYZ is $2 million, and the collateral amount XYZ is required to post is $1 million. And therefore, the correct answer is A. Question 3. Which of the following statements is correct? Increasing the margining threshold in a margining agreement reduces the probability of default of the counterparty. A bank can eliminate credit exposure to a counterparty by executing a weekly margining agreement with a margining threshold of 0 and a minimum transferable amount of 0. The higher the credit quality of a counterparty, the lower the PFE. Including a 2-year early termination clause in the confirmation of a 10-year interest rate swap with a counterparty effectively reduces the tenor of the exposure to 2 years. Here are the 4 permissible answers. Solution to question 3. The margining threshold in a margining agreement does not reduce the counterparty's probability of default. Margining agreements are credit mitigation tools that reduce the loss the bank is likely to incur in the case of counterparty default. Executing a weekly margining agreement with a margining threshold of 0 and a minimum transferable amount of 0 reduces significantly the bank's credit exposure to the counterparty. However, credit exposure still arises between margin call dates, which are weekly in this case. If the counterparty defaults between margin call dates and the portfolio's value has risen further from the bank's perspective, some amount of exposure would arise. The higher the credit quality of the counterparty, the lower its probability of default. The PFE, however, is based solely on transaction tenor and volatility of the underlying, and is independent of the counterparty's credit quality. Inclusion of a 2-year early termination clause in the confirmation of the IRS gives the bank the right to terminate the transaction in 2 years and to request settlement of the contract fair value from the counterparty. this is effectively equivalent to a reduction of credit exposure's tenor to 2 years. Therefore, the correct answer is D, as in David. Question 4. XYZ has just entered a 3-year interest rate swap with notional of $100 million with Best Bank. XYZ receives 6-month LIBOR and pays 5% fixed. Assume the curve is flat and rates move only in parallel shifts up or down. You are asked to use the simulated market factors we had generated in the cells indicated here of Excel file simulation.xls worksheet simulation with a 1-month time step. Assuming no credit risk mitigation of any kind has been implemented, the maximum peak PFE at a 99% confidence level over 3 years and the expected exposure in 1 year are respectively, and here are the 4 permissible answers. We repeat the same steps as in Chapter 2 in this Excel file quiz.xls worksheet 3-year swap no mitigation, where we list the inputs in cells B4 to C8 and have copied the simulated US dollar interest rates as instructed into cells B14 to AM 513. Then in cells B515 to AM 1014, we calculate the future value of the IRS using the same equations as in Chapter 1. The PFE is calculated in cells B1016 to AM 1515 as the higher of 0 and the future value of the IRS. Then the peak PFE appears in cells B1518 to AM 1518 and equals, as before, the 99th percentile of the PFE for the corresponding maturity, while the maximum peak PFE appearing on row 1520 is quite simply the largest of all these calculated values and equals $3,474,901. Finally, the expected exposure is calculated in cells C1522 to AM 1522, revealing in cell O1522 a value of $702,909 for the 1-year tenor. Therefore, the correct answer is C as in Charles. Question 5. Using the same inputs as in question 4, assume the two parties have executed a bilateral margining agreement with monthly margin calls and a margining threshold of $3 million. The maximum peak PFE at the 99% confidence level over 3 years and the expected exposure in 1 year are now respectively, and here are the 4 permissible answers. Solution to question 5. Repeating again the same steps as earlier in this Excel file, quiz.xls, worksheet 3-year swap MA for margining agreement. We list the inputs in cells B4 to C8 and copy the simulated US dollar interest rates as instructed in cells B14 to AM 513. We calculate next the future value of the IRS in cells B515 to AM 1014. PFE is calculated in cells B1016 to AM 1515, assuming monthly margin calls and a margining threshold of $3 million that you can see here in the formula, in the same manner as described in Chapter 2. Peak PFE appears in cells 1518 to AM 1518, and once again, maximum peak PFE is simply the largest of all these calculated values and equals $3 million. The expected exposure is calculated in cells 1522 to AM 1522, which reveal in cell O 1522 a value of $691,927 for the 1-year tenor. Therefore, the correct answer is A, as in apple. Question 6. The existing portfolio of transactions between Best Bank and XYZ includes only a $100 million interest rate swap with a 3-year remaining maturity, with XYZ receiving 6-month LIBOR and paying 5% fixed. Assume the current fair value of the swap is 0. The most recent 6-month LIBOR fixing was 5%, and that the yield curve is flat with rates moving only in parallel shifts up or down. The two parties are contemplating a 2-year FX forward, with XYZ buying 40 million euros against dollars at 1.4277. You are instructed to use the same simulated market factors generated in cells B1535 to BK3036 of Excel file simulation.xls, worksheet simulation, with the 1-month time step. You wish to calculate the necessary increase in credit lines measured by the marginal impact of the new transaction on the portfolio's maximum peak PFE up to 2 years, assuming alternatively that in the first case netting is enforceable and a margining agreement with a $3 million margining threshold and monthly margin calls is executed, and in the second alternative that netting is enforceable but no margining agreement is executed. These are respectively, and here are the 4 permissible answers. Solution to question 6. We repeat the same steps as earlier in this Excel file quiz.xls worksheet portfolio, in which we list the inputs in cells B4 to F8 and have copied the simulated market factors as instructed into cells B12 or 13 rather to 513 across to AM 513 for dollar interest rates, then B515 to AM 1014 for euro interest rates, and finally B1016 to AM 1515 for euro dollar spot. Then in B1517 to AM 2517, we calculate the future values of both the IRS and the FX forward using the same equations as in Chapter 1. The portfolio PFE, including the new transaction and assuming enforceable netting, is calculated in cells B2519 to AM 3018, while the portfolio PFE, including the new transaction and assuming enforceable netting and the margining agreement, is calculated in cells B3020 to AM 3519. The portfolio peak PFEs out to 2 years and including the new transaction appear in B3522 to AA 3523, while the maximum peak PFE for both scenarios are calculated in cells B3525 to AA 3526. The maximum peak PFEs of the existing portfolio under the two scenarios were calculated in questions 4 and 5 and are reproduced here in cells C3528, or rather B3528 to AA 3529. The impact of the new transaction on the portfolio maximum peak PFE is calculated in cells B3531 to AA 3532 and equals 0 with enforceable netting, the lower row, and with the margining agreement, versus $15,820,359 with enforceable netting but no margining agreement. Therefore, the correct answer is B, as in boy. This completes the quiz, as well as the entire module on the measurement and management of counterparty credit risk.